in this presentation, I'm going to be talking about visual scanning in football with the broader context of decision making in football and the influence of visual scanning on that. I'm Thomas Magakian. I've got my Twitter handle there, mostly so that people can get in touch if they have any questions or any feedback about the content of this presentation. So that'll be up again at the end, but please do make use of that to get in touch if you do have any questions or comments or anything like that. So a little bit about me. So I am from Victoria in Australia. I did my undergraduate study in Melbourne and then moved to Brisbane and did my PhD in Brisbane in Australia. So my undergraduate study is in sport and exercise science and also psychology. And I've sort of carried that through into my research as well. I've done a little bit of applied work in a professional football setting in Australia as a sports scientist, so sort of covering all things from GPS to wellness monitoring, a little bit of video work and athletic development as well. So covered a few different bases in some applied work, but a lot of my stuff is really in the research area and in this visual scanning and decision making area of football. So did my PhD and finished that a little over a year ago, and it was on that exact topic. And a lot of what I'll be talking about is from what I've sort of discovered throughout doing the PhD and also my own research findings and how that can be applied to practice to hopefully help coaches. So this is just a brief overview of what I'll be going through. I'll start with a little bit of theory, nothing too dense, but hopefully to give some context of why I'm giving these recommendations and some of the background of what influences this work. I'll go through some of the relevant research and evidence that we currently have, a bit of an understanding of what good scanning is and how we can measure scanning. I'll touch on some things to do with age and development of scanning, and also some considerations for training design. The reason that I've come to this sort of schedule of the presentation is based on the questions that I've had. Had a whole heap of questions come through, lots of really good questions from coaches, and they generally all fit in one of these 5 categories here. So that's sort of the reason for having it broken down like this. So hopefully that'll be the most valuable to everyone. I'll start off just with a really brief introduction of what scanning actually is, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. And I always like to start with this little image of meerkats because it shows really nicely and simply what scanning is, what we're mostly talking about when we're talking about scanning. And it is that very distinctive head movement that the meerkats are showing here. So that's the main action is rotation of the head in order to visually perceive what's happening around in the environment. We can see it very clearly from the meerkats, but we also see it very clearly in football players. Now obviously when we're picking up visual information through this scanning, we're using our eyes as well as our head, but we can also use our trunk to orientate around the environment. The main thing that we focus on is the head. And I think this little image of the meerkats demonstrates that very well. So this is the action we're talking about. To put it more in a football context and to show the value of why this is important, I've just got a couple of images here that I've just taken screenshots of a video from the Bundesliga. And it really shows the value of scanning both in attack and defense. So we can see there's 3 defending players all looking the same direction. And you can see the path of the red attacking player there that he's taken. And then in the next shot, we can see a few frames ahead, the attacking player's moved, the ball is coming across, and all 3 of those defenders have turned around to see that no one's been marking that run. The reason that they haven't been able to mark that run is because all their visual information has been from where the cross is coming from and not scanning around their environment to see that the attacker has made a run in behind them. So I think that also shows quite clearly the value of scanning, why it's very important, and I think it's quite a neat example. So for each section, I've got a question sort of posed like this, and this is sort of a lot of different questions all coming together that I just sort of put into one question for each section. So, how can the theory help to understand visual scanning? So I think something that's important to recognise is that we don't just have a football player and that's all that's relevant here. We have this player and environment system. And these two things work together, they combine in order to have meaning in the football environment. So I've got that question there, what is a footballer without a football environment? Pretty much they're just a person. There is no context for how we should think about their behaviours and what they're doing without the football environment being there. So hopefully this demonstrates that we have players, but these players are always situated within a certain environment. And when we're talking about scanning, the relevant environment is this football pitch and the players and everything else that's around. And so these two things come together, and through these things coming together, the player and the environment, we have information is created and there is opportunity for the players. So it's because of the player in their environment, they have opportunities and they can pick up visual information and other types of information, but mostly visual in our case. And it is these two things. So if we separate these two things, the player and their natural environment of football, then we have to think about it differently. The context that we have is very different. And so to have the correct context of a footballer, we have to think about players in a football environment. And then we also have action and information. And so scanning, that visual scanning is an action. It is something that we are doing, and by doing that action, we are able to perceive information. So scanning is an action that supports the perception of information. And that information is information from the environment. So by scanning, looking around, that allows us to visually perceive the environmental information. It creates a connection between the player and their environment. And players need this relevant information so that they can make informed decisions. Okay, so they can make decisions, they're making decisions all the time, but for those decisions to be informed, to be good decisions based on good information, useful information, that's where scanning is really important. And so through the scanning, they're able to pick up, visually perceive the relevant information that is needed for informed decision making that is actually useful for the situation they're in. But then we get to this question of, well, what is the right information? And that is a bit difficult to say in a lot of cases, but in general, it's information that provides functional opportunities. And what that means for a football player is things like the other players on the pitch, the ball, where the ball is, where the goals are, the physical goals, but potentially also other goals in the match. The pitch markings, where there's free space, lots of different things in the environment that give players an idea of what's happening around them in the game and what is relevant in the game. And so these things are all things that help them to actually play. There's other things in the environment that probably don't help them so much in terms of figuring out the game and solving the problems of the game. So things like the crowd. They're important, they influence performance, but they're not things that are going to help players figure out what's happening in the game. So it's not necessarily functional. So we want players to be scanning for things like the ball, free space, pitch markings, that sort of stuff. The other important consideration here is who is perceiving. So what is the player, and what is the right information for that player? So we know that there's these certain types of information that are going to be important, like the players and the ball and the goals. But what's important for each player at each moment might be a little bit different. So it's very important when we're thinking about what is the right information. We also need to think about who is the player, who is perceiving this information. and how does that player relate to the environment, and what does that mean? We also have this other information that is also relevant when we're thinking about decision making generally, but also perceptual and scanning actions. So we've got this perceptual stuff, the scanning in this case, but we also have, we know there's also big technical influence, big tactical influence, and also the physical influence. So the technical ability of a player, how well they can pass, how well they can run, control the ball, these are going to influence the scanning actions that players do, why players scan, what they're intending to get out of their scanning. So for example, if a player doesn't feel technically capable of passing a ball 50 metres accurately, they're probably not going to look for a passing opportunity that's that far away. And so that they're going to have slightly different scanning actions because they don't want to pass it a long distance, they want to play short passes, for example. We also have tactical influence, so the way that a team plays might influence the scanning actions that players use. It might be a team that does lots of short passing, very quick passing, moves the ball around the pitch very quickly. In order to do that well, players need to constantly be aware of what's happening around them, which means they constantly need to be scanning. So that the way that the team is tactically made up might influence the scanning actions that players use. Physically, we also are getting some evidence now that the physical state of the players will be influencing the scanning that they're doing. So someone's had a really high, intense, long period of running. They're going to be physically fatigued, and that could be influencing the scanning that the players do. Partly maybe because they're no longer capable of making a pass or making a run, so they're maybe scanned differently in order to make up for that. So these are just a few examples, but the reason I bring them up is to make sure that we are still considering everything else that's happening. It's not just the scanning and that's the only thing that's relevant. We also need to consider other things that are going to be influencing scanning, how the different aspects interrelate with each other in order to come together for the decision-making process. So what do we already know about visual scanning? So in the research, we need to sort of rely on the research or make use of the research at least, so we can make sure we're understanding things in their proper context, and we need to integrate this with what we know as coaches already. So when going through the research, I like to start with this paper because it tries to understand what coaches' perceptions are of visual exploratory activity, so scanning. And I think this is a really important place to start because obviously coaches have a lot of their own knowledge and understanding based on their experiences. So in the research, trying to understand that and get a good understanding of what coaches believe and what they've experienced is a really good place to start when talking about the research and what's relevant. So in general, what they found is that the more highly qualified coaches had more favourable perceptions of scanning, introducing scanning, how often they deliver it and how they deliver it, and how they evaluate it. So generally, the more highly qualified coaches would introduce scanning earlier, so with younger players. The way they would deliver it would be different. So more likely to use some maybe what we might call better methods of coaching. They also identified some barriers to delivery. So coaches felt that it's difficult to train scanning, partly maybe because of their knowledge of the action, what scanning is, why it's useful. So maybe some lack of knowledge there makes it more difficult. But also some barriers identified were to do with the resources available. So for lots of other things to do with football, there's lots of resources available and it's very open and lots of stuff out there, both formal and informal training. but maybe not so much for scanning, which hopefully this will help with that, and some other stuff over the last couple of years will help with that, to try and overcome that barrier of not having the resources and maybe not feeling coaches have the knowledge. This paper also had some interesting things in terms of evaluation of scanning, so to do with the measurement and how coaches would evaluate scanning actions and if it was good or not. So coaches tend to look at the behaviours or the actions that follow scanning actions. So maybe it's things to do with what players do with the ball, whether they have a successful pass or something like that. That's one way that you might be able to evaluate the value of scanning. There's also just direct observation, so just watching players and looking at, are they scanning or not? Does it look like they're scanning at the right times? Does it look like they're trying to find passing options, those sorts of things? And then the last sort of evaluation method, which I think is a really valuable one, is questioning with players. So asking things like, oh, so what did you see there, or what was it that made you make that run? So having questioning that is related to scanning as a way of evaluating and getting an understanding for what players are doing and why they're doing it. So I'd highly recommend having a read of that paper if you are interested to get more detail on that. But I think it's good because it shows that coaches are thinking about scanning, especially the ones that are more highly qualified, and they're also trying to coach scanning with the resources that they have, which is a really positive sign. A nice other little study, so this is fairly early on, back in 2013. There's two papers from 2013 that I'm going to go through. And this paper looked at if youth midfield soccer players were scanning or not before they had possession, and then what they ended up doing with the ball once they did get possession. Nice little study, one of the two early ones that sort of really brought this as a topic, as a research topic. What they found was that when players, these youth midfield players, did scan before they got the ball, they made more forward passes, they made more passes to the attacking half, they turned with the ball more often, and they also experienced less pressure on the ball when they scanned before getting the ball. So all of these factors really nicely align with some of the theory that we know about scanning. And so we know that scanning is a way of picking up information about the environment and what's happening. And as a logical extension of that, if you have a better understanding of what's happening, then you're probably more likely to play forward passes as part of the tactical reasoning for the game. You're more likely to play a forward pass. You're probably, if you know what's happening around you, more likely to turn with the ball. And probably also because they've been scanning, they've been moving into positions that puts them in a better spot so that when they do receive the ball, they have less pressure. So really, all really good signs and things that show the benefit of scanning before receiving the ball. The other study from 2013 is this one, and this one looked at English Premier League players. And so we've got elite level as compared to youth players. And this one looked at the frequency of scanning actions, so how often players turn their head to visually pick up information. And sort of the main outcome from this was looking at the percentage of passes that were completed, so pass success. And what they found is that when players had a very low frequency of scanning, so 0.2 a second, they had just over 50% success of passing. But when they increased that scanning frequency to be much higher, so 0.4 to 1.8 per second, the odds of a successful pass increased significantly. So if we take those two studies together, we see that players are trying to do things, play more attacking passes and turn with the ball and move it around and also have less pressure, but they're also more likely to have successful passes when they scan very frequently. And this leads us to a few of my studies. So this is the first one that I did in my PhD. with the main difference being the way that we measured scanning. So in the previous studies, it was based on manually counting by watching footage. It's a good way of doing it if you have not a lot of resources, but it's also quite time consuming. And so in my PhD, what we set about doing was coming up with a way of more easily collecting data to do with scanning so that we can look at some more complex interactions and things like that. So this was the first in a series of studies. Fairly simple. We had a player in a lab environment wearing a headband with an inertial sensor attached to it, and that's what is collecting data about the head movement and gives it an output of scanning. So in this study, we were just interested in the response speed, how quickly someone was able to complete a passing action that we deemed to be correct. So in this case, there was 4 different choices, but only one of them correct. And the players needed to, once they had possession of the virtual ball, they needed to select the correct response as quickly as they could. And what we found is that as the frequency of their scanning got higher, so they scanned more and more often, the time it took to select the correct option got less and less. So they were able to do a faster response the more they were scanning. Another study that is almost an extension of that first lab study, but with some more high-tech solutions, this time actually using a real ball, so a real passing action. We used the Footballnaut to collect the data. Again, players were wearing a inertial sensor on their head to collect the head scanning data, and they were run through a standardized series of passing actions in the Footballnaut. The main sort of outcome that we were interested in here was some of the age differences that we might find. So we had a group of under 13 players and a group of under 23 players from a high level club, and we were able to compare some of the differences in age in terms of how the scanning actions contribute to the pass outcome and the speed of the passes. And the interesting things that we found, firstly, was that there were some differences between under 13s and under 23s in what contributes to a fast passing response. So for the under 13s, being a midfield player, they were able to produce passing responses more quickly, most likely because of their experiences early on in their career of being in a higher pressure environment surrounded by defenders. But the other thing that contributed to a faster pass was the frequency of their scanning actions. So if they were scanning more frequently before they received the ball, they were able to complete the passing action more quickly. For the under 23s, it was slightly different. For the under 23s, the thing that contributed to them passing quickly was actually the size, or the excursion is the technical term that we use. So how big the head movements were. And this, in under 23s, having bigger head movements before receiving the ball contributed to faster passing responses. So we can see a slight difference between under 13s and the 23s in what contributes to faster passes in terms of the scanning. And we're able to discover this because of using the inertial sensor units in order to collect the data as opposed to manually counting. So a slight advantage of using a sort of more high-tech solution. The next study in this series is looking at similar things, so looking at the scanning and the outcomes of so the technical actions as a result of the scanning actions in 11v11 games, full pitch games, with the players wearing the head sensors to collect the data instead of the manual counting. So again, we were looking at the frequency and the size of these scanning head movements, and we quantified these for the 1 second all the way through to 10 seconds before players receive the ball. And what we found in general was that when players had a higher frequency of scanning, they were more likely to play a pass in a forward direction, more an attacking pass. So similar to previous findings there. What we found in terms of the size of the scanning actions, these resulted in players more likely to turn with the ball and more likely to switch the direction of the play. So if they receive the ball from the left, they go and pass it to the right, for example. So what we can gain from these two together is that it's both the frequency of the scanning actions, how often players are scanning, and also how big the head movements are that contribute to the outcomes and the technical actions. What we also found is that when players are scanning and how much in different time periods is important for these outcomes. And it seems from our results that roughly around the 3 seconds before possession is sort of the most closely related to these outcomes. So very frequent scanning in about 3 seconds before receiving the pass, players are more likely to make forward passes. Similar thing for size, but it seems like there is a sort of sweet spot of when you're looking at these actions of when is important. So if you're going to be measuring scanning yourself, maybe 10 seconds, 8 seconds before a player receives the ball isn't as important as maybe 2 or 3 seconds before they receive the ball. And so we've also got a couple of studies that directly look at some of the constraints on a player and how that influences the scanning actions of the players. So this one was most of the heavy lifting for this study was done by Georgia on this paper. And what was being investigated was the influence of the size of the pitch on the scanning players. So in general, how much space players had. And so we had 3 different pitch sizes. We had the middle pitch there, which was the same amount of space per player as a normal 11v11 pitch. We also had half that space and double that space. And what we found was, in general, players were scanning more when they did not have the ball, which is a positive thing. And also players scanned more often when they were playing on a smaller pitch. So when they had less space per player, they would scan more often. And this is an important finding if you're thinking about, well, how can we train scanning? How can we encourage people to scan? If we put them in very tight areas where they've got less time and space on the ball, that seems to encourage them to scan more. And so that could be one way of potentially developing scanning. And then we have another study, again using the head sensors and also combining some GPS data as well in this study. And we were looking at 3 different things in this study: the playing position, the position on the pitch, and also the phase of play and how each of those influence the scanning actions of players. So this first figure I think is quite interesting. It shows a few different things. On one axis we have the average frequency of the head turns, and on the other axis we have the size of the head turns. And immediately we can see that those 2 things are quite related. If we're scanning more often, we're increasing the total size of these scanning actions as well. But we've got different coloured dots for different playing positions. And so we can see a couple of things here. One is that it's quite scattered. So there's a lot of variety between playing positions. Each dot is a single player. And it is quite mixed. So we can look at the fullbacks. We've got 2 fullbacks that are very low on both the frequency and excursion, and then a couple of fullbacks that are fairly high on the excursion, and one that's very high on the frequency as well. So even though they're playing the same position, the scanning actions that these players are using are actually fairly different to each other. We can also maybe see some more general trends. So we've got a cluster of central midfield players that are all very high in the frequency and excursion. There's also some that are sort of mid-range. So this tells us a couple of things. We also, as well as thinking about playing position, and there seems to be maybe some influence of playing position, we need to consider that each player is individual. And we need to sort of assess these things on an individual basis. We can't just say, okay, they're a striker, they must be doing this number of scanning actions, or they're a midfielder, they must be doing it very highly. So there's a lot more context than just a single factor. We can also look at the position on the pitch, and this finding that we had here was actually not what we expected at all for this. So the data that we've got here is just looking at the frequency of the scanning, and this is across an entire game, all the players across the entire game. And so we've really reduced the data down into a single number per area of the pitch position. But what we find is that actually the central areas of the pitch, so if we're looking centrally here, but also centrally down the length of the pitch, in general, players are scanning less frequently than the sort of wider or deeper areas. So like I said, this was not something we expected to find, but also this is something that we find probably because we're looking at all the players across the whole game. So again, it's a bit of a word of warning almost of when we're looking at these things, we need to again consider the context of what we're looking at. Using all the data across an entire game maybe isn't the most important factor or the best way to look at it. We need to be looking at particular instances of the game, and there'll be certain times where players, when they're in the middle of the pitch, will be and should be scanning very, very frequently. But then there's times where they won't be scanning very often. For example, if there's a defender standing at the halfway line when their team is in possession, they might not be very active in the play, and so maybe they're not scanning very much, as an example. And we also have the phase of play. So we have 4 different phases here, is how we broke it down. We have when an individual player is in possession of the ball themselves, when a player's team is in possession of the ball, when the opposition is in possession of the ball, and when the ball is in transition between offense and defending, or defending to attacking. And what we can see here, we've got each of these black dots is an individual player, and we can see that in this data set, when players had the ball, they were having the biggest size of their head turns of their scanning. Roughly similar whether the team was in possession or the opposition was in possession, and the least or the smallest scanning actions when the ball is in transition. And I think this is a very interesting finding because to me this is potentially one of the most important times to be scanning. If players can have a really good understanding of what's happening around them when the ball is in transition, they might be able to respond what's happening to the game and be more proactive in the next action that they do in order to get better outcomes. So I think that's potentially an area for improvement, and a focus area for training is to develop those transition periods, and in particular developing the scanning actions that happen within the transition periods. And I think this is the last study I've got here. It's a fairly recent one, and the reason I'm bringing it up is to have an understanding of how virtual reality may or may not be useful for looking at these types of actions. So this paper looked at the playing level differences of a virtual reality system, not specifically scanning, but there were some activities within the virtual reality system that are sort of based more towards scanning. What they found is that the higher level players performed better in the virtual reality system than lower level players, which is a positive sign. But we need to be quite cautious about how we interpret the results of this type of study. So how we can use VR and the value of VR. When we're looking at the value and how we should be using virtual reality, we need to really think about if we're getting the same types of actions in the virtual reality world as we want and as we expect in the real world when players are playing the game. If we're producing the same sorts of actions when we're in the virtual world, then that's probably a positive sign for using these systems for benefit when we're actually playing in the real world. So if we're getting similar rates of scanning based on the type of information that we're perceiving in virtual reality, then that's probably a good thing. But if we're producing actions in virtual reality that are not similar to what we want to get in the real world, then we need to think carefully about if that's actually valuable, because it's possible that players will become used to the virtual reality environment, and the skills that they develop and the actions that they use might actually have a negative effect on their real world performance. So this is a constantly developing area. I think it's just something that we need to make sure we're using in the right way and thinking very critically about how we can use this research. Okay, so the next section is to do with how we can actually measure scanning and what we can consider to be good scanning. What is the type of scanning that we actually want? There's a few different ways that we can measure scanning. And I sort of touched on the high-tech or low-tech solutions. The high-tech ones, some of the things that we used in my PhD, so wearable devices, inertial measurement units. These can be used in order to collect data on a lot of players at once and to get very accurate data about the movements that are happening. And this can be processed automatically and then you can get an output in a similar way that you would with a GPS report, for example. It's obviously much more expensive, but it can be a big time saver if you have the resources available to use it. And it can also allow some much more in-depth analysis and synchronization with other data sources, like GPS, for example, so you can see how scanning in a particular area of the pitch is changing, or how it relates to measures of fatigue and things like that. The low-tech solutions, which are probably going to be more relevant for a lot of coaches, particularly if you don't have big budgets. And there's a few ways of going about this. I think there just needs to probably be a recognition that there is a bit more of a time requirement needed in order to collect the data initially. There's some really good sources out there about examples of this being done in the past, and it can be as simple as having a very simple rating measure where you might watch one or two players and have a measure from 1 to 10 about your initial understanding of how frequently someone's scanning, or the value of that scanning, or the positioning and how that relates to someone's scanning within a game. So no actual new technology required. It relies a bit more heavily on coaches' expertise and understanding of the actions in the game, but definitely something that can be used. I think the main thing with measurement of scanning, as with anything else, is to use the measurement as a guide and not a target to get to. So even though we know that very frequent scanning is a good thing, I don't think we should be trying to reach a target of a certain frequency and then say that's what we want. We should, as on my next slide, we're going to be aiming for very frequent and large scanning actions, but we shouldn't have a particular number in our head that we're aiming for necessarily. I think a better way to go about it is to use measurement as a guide, but to also measure the outcomes of the scanning. So are players performing higher pass rates, success rates, or are they getting into positions that are more valuable as a result of their scanning, for example? So what is good scanning? In general, I like to say that extensive is a nice way to sum up what is good. So extensive, I mean, we should be scanning often, and the scanning actions should be fairly big. So we want large scanning actions. So not lots of very small ones, rather relatively frequent ones, but ones that cover a bigger distance, so we can see more of what's happening around us. But there's a few sort of things to consider in terms of if extensive is always good. The main thing that we want from scanning, the reason we scan, is because that brings in visual information that supports functional and informs decision making. Scanning is only good if it does that. We can't just have lots of really often frequent scanning if it's not actually helping us with our decision making or with the movements that we do. So if it's not actually functional, then it's probably not good scanning. And also the timing of the scanning is important. So there's certain periods within a game where it's better to be scanning and certain periods where it's better not to be scanning potentially. So for example, when the ball is traveling between one player and the next, the path of that ball is very predictable. We know that that's not going to change. It's only going to change once it gets to another player or if a player intercepts the ball. And it's this time, this short period of time of ball traveling from one player to the next, that is the best time to scan. So between each pass, as the ball is traveling, we should be encouraging players to be scanning, picking out what's happening around the place. But when a player is physically touching the ball with their foot, or controlling the ball, this is a good time to be looking towards the ball because we can pick up the information from that player about what that player might be doing. But then that player is probably going to pass the ball, they're going to dribble. When the ball is not physically touching a player, the movement of the ball is much more predictable, and this is the best time to scan. So that's a very important consideration when we're trying to develop the scanning actions, and maybe when we're having discussions with players and trying to talk about the importance of scanning, the timing of the scanning is a very important factor to consider. And finally, we also need to consider the individual and the situation when we're thinking about what good scanning is. So the individual, it's the case that not everyone needs to scan the same amount in order to pick up the functional information. So some players might be able to scan less and still get all the information they need than other players. And on the flip side, some players might need to scan very frequently to make sure they are constantly updating the information that they have. So there's a bit of an individual element there. And also the situation. So there's certain situations where scanning will be very, very important, and other situations where scanning is less important. In my example of a central defender standing in the middle of the pitch when the ball is up their attacking end, not particularly involved in the game, but also most of the information they need is going to be in front of them. So big scanning actions are going to be less necessary, but that central defender, when they're defending a corner, they're going to need to pick up information from the corner kicker as well as the player they're marking, and so much bigger scanning actions are needed. So the situation that the player is in is going to be an important consideration when we think about what good scanning is. So we can also have some age considerations. We had a lot of questions about when should we develop scanning, how young, those sorts of things. And I've got a couple of comments on that, but nothing too extensive, I don't think. To help explain, I'd like to sort of take a bit more of a theoretical approach in terms of exploration. So scanning is visual exploration, but exploration in general is very important for development. And so children explore in various ways from birth. So they'll move their arms around in different ways. They'll explore with their hands to explore objects. They'll put things in their mouth. These are all types of exploration, and it's the child developing and learning about the environment in the same way that we scan to visually explore. We're trying to learn about the environment when we're scanning. So I think that as a concept, exploration is very important for development and learning, and we can explore in various different ways. When we're thinking about how young, we should try and develop visual exploration, scanning. We can think about how children learn to cross the road. So they're probably at an age where they can maybe walk independently of their parents, and they're going to be learning to cross a road while they're there in that situation with their parents. And I know the way that I was brought up, at least in Australia, we were always encouraged to look left, right, and left again, or maybe it's the other way, but we had to look both ways before we crossed the road. Very young, we were very young when we learned to do this, but the action we're learning was scanning. We needed to look left and right and left to be able to pick up the information that's happening on the road to know if it's safe or not. So we didn't need to wait until we knew how to drive or until we knew how to ride a bike or anything like that. It's something that we learned very early on. About the same time we're learning to walk and in that situation as a very young child. I think we can take the same sort of approach when we're talking about developing scanning in football players. The younger the better. So we should be developing scanning early. I don't think there is an age that's too early to do activities that are going to help players develop scanning. The reason for that is that it is a skill, just like everything else in football, that needs to be developed. So just as we would be wanting to develop a player's ability to control the ball and pass the ball and head the ball and perform fake movements and all that sort of stuff, scanning is another skill, and actually scanning influences our ability to do all of those other things. And so it is as important, if not more important, than those other skills to develop. So if we place that amount of importance on scanning, we should also try and develop it as early as we can, and we should try and develop it very often, just as often as we are doing passing actions, controlling actions, running, all of that sort of stuff. We should also be doing scanning. It shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be one of the first thoughts of our training design is how are we including the development of scanning in this training situation. So speaking of training design, what are some considerations that we should be thinking about? I've sort of broken this into two categories. One is that we should encourage scanning, and the other is that we shouldn't discourage scanning. So in terms of encouraging scanning, there's a few sort of simple dot points that I think should be considered. The first is to use a football environment as much as possible in all of the training that we're doing. If we think back to the theory, we can think that, well, what is a footballer without a football environment? They're just a person standing there. So if we want to develop this very innately very important action for football performance, we should be putting players in a football environment. Let's actually make them footballers. So when we're developing activities, let's make it a football activity. And we also should be thinking about including functional information. So including things like goals, other players, the ball, pitch markings, space and lack of space, things like that. We should be thinking about playing with these ideas and including these things in our activities. So we want to make sure that we are creating environments that are football relevant by using this functional information. As much as possible, I think we should also be including decision making. So the reason that scanning is such an important factor of performance and of football is that it is so vital for decision making, and decision making is what makes or breaks players in a game. And so when we're training, we should be including decision making as opposed to having predefined outcomes. We might have certain situations where we have types of actions that we want to be the outcome, but we should always have some element of decision making within the environment in order to get to that outcome. And the last dot point of how we can encourage scanning is in the way that we communicate the action itself. So you see lots of coaches putting a lot of emphasis on technical ability, ability to control the ball, pass the ball, on fitness, on the tactical concepts of play. We should also be doing a similar thing with how we encourage and communicate scanning actions. So have discussions with players about the value of scanning and talking about how decisions came about. I think this is all very important in just having players understand why scanning is important. And part of the way we can do that is the way that we communicate. So give scanning the platform that it deserves in development. The other way that we should be training scanning is to make sure we don't discourage scanning. And I'll give some examples about what I mean by this to sort of illustrate the point, because I think a lot of training actively discourages players to scan. So if you think about how you might teach a young player to pass the ball, very early on, we're talking young players, five-year-olds maybe. How would you teach them to pass a ball? Most likely it's two players standing across from each other passing a ball backwards and forwards. Now I know this is the aim of this activity is to teach the passing action, but we know that in 10 years' time, the reason a player is going to make a pass is because of what's happening around them, not just because there's a player there to pass to. And the information that's required to do that, to make a good decision, is based on scanning. And so by using this sort of very, very simple passing situation where there's no decision making, there's no need to look anywhere but directly in front, that is actively discouraging a scanning action. In a similar way, if we think about very structured training activities where there is a specific outcome, maybe an unopposed passing drill, where the ball might be worked around the pitch, but there is a specific place where you receive the ball from and where you pass the ball to. So very, very structured passing activity. In this situation, there is no reason to scan. If you know where the ball is going to come from and you know where the ball has to go, there is no need to scan. So by doing this type of activity, I think you're actively discouraging people from scanning. So I think there's within this, there's ways to add a need for scanning. So you might add some defenders who are going to be around the place and intercepting passes. Things like that. You can build some decision making in there to make it a little bit more complex, with the intention of trying to bring in some value of scanning. And I think this last dot point of who is making decisions during training activities, if you think to yourself, do the players need to make decisions about how to solve this game, or is it already built into the game? That might help you to understand if you're discouraging scanning or not. So if you have a game like that passing situation, there's only one choice for the players. They don't need to make a decision about where they need to pass the ball to. So the decision making has been made by the coach. And that's probably discouraging scanning. Whereas if the players have to make decisions about how to solve the game or the activity, then it's more likely that scanning is going to be encouraged within that activity. So that's my presentation. That's all I've got for you. Hopefully it's been useful. And as I said at the start, please do get in touch if you have any questions or comments, feedback, anything you'd like to discuss. Then I would love to hear it. And Twitter is probably the best way to get in touch with me. If there's research articles that you would like to get access to, please get in touch about that as well. I'm happy to help out with that.